as complete as can be, going on there for 4, 5, 6 days, and you had a small group of people called the Black Bloc, who is known as the famous Eugene anarchists, who threw some bricks through some windows, and the press zeroes in on this, and the entire story of what that movement was completely changed. But I still maintain it's not just the perception and the distortions of the media, but something in the very nature of it. So Zoe's question is very legitimate. How are we going to square NV plus V equals V, famous Naegler's law, with the madman with the sword analogy, which is what this kind of structure is called, this episode? You can't. That's the point I'm making, is that there comes a point where, in an emergency, almost everything is stripped away. All the laws that you want to apply earlier on, when you've got the time and you can do the organizing, you can't do them. And you're just reduced to one simple thing: not to hate your opponent. It really comes down to that, and I'm really glad you asked me that. So you can go through all of this horrible stuff, and somehow, if you do it without hating that person or persons, you've rescued a nonviolent core in your own behavior, and that nonviolent core, we believe, will eventually lead to doing good work on the social order. Will change things for the better. Though at the moment we don't know how to tell you what all ways that'll play out. That's mysterious. So this was part of my point, that the hierarchical nature of Gandhi's campaigns was an artifact of several things, one of them being that these are emergencies. And in fact, from the time he gets back to India, or at least from the time he makes his first move in 1916 till the time that you get independence 31 years later, you're basically in a state of perpetual emergency, right? Because the violence had happened 200 years ago, and now you're trying to get rid of it. And the third thing that differentiates the hierarchical nature. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you consider now what does
This is a very good question. Are we in an emergency now? Well, I think I'm going to give you a very good academic answer to that. Yes and no. I think that we can be working on various levels, and some of those will be for the long term, and some of those will be for the short term, and I think that we have to be working on all of them. Actually, the whole class is about answering that question. I think we should come back to it at the end of the semester and see what we're going to come up with. Yeah, hold on to that. I think there are some things which, let me put it this way, there are some things which would require late stage, fairly drastic emergency actions if we say to ourselves, this has got to be stopped, I don't care what it takes. So if we were to decide that we're not going to let another 20,000 troops go into Iraq, or if we were to decide that the country's got to stop practicing torture, things like that, those things are in emergency states. But at the same time, we could be slowly educating the public so that they'll never happen again. So we use emergency measures to get rid of them right now, and we use longer term measures to make sure that they don't creep back. This is one of the key principles we're going to be seeing in all of the movements that we're looking at, that they can do a beautiful job in getting rid of a horrible dictatorship, and 1 or 2 years later, it's the same old, same old. You're back in the same poverty, the same cycles of repression, because you didn't do the long-term work to build in the deep changes that get down into culture and actually start mobilizing a different kind of drive from the person. So I think we should be working across the board on almost all these things. But that's a great question. Okay, now if I remember, I was about to say the third criterion, which tells you that don't be fooled, the hierarchical structure of a campaign like the Salt March is not the nature of nonviolent world order. So we have the fact that you can fire the top leadership, it's an emergency, so everything is likely to look weird. And finally, it really is mobilizing a different drive. Gandhi is deeply committed to the well-being of the British people. He's absolutely convinced that the best thing he can do for them is get them the hell out of there. I shouldn't even put it that way. Get them out of there as rulers, and have them stay on as friends. By the way, how many of you saw Attenborough's movie, Gandhi? Okay. I would strongly recommend it. If for no other reason, I keep referring to it. It's just part of my consciousness now. It'll be easier to figure out what I'm talking about. But if you remember the scene where he says, it's right after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, they're having a hearing, and one of the officials says to him, well, boy, you don't just expect us to get up and leave, do you? And he says, that is exactly what I expect you to do. Only I expect you to go out as friends, not as enemies. So with apologies for the ethnic accents and all the rest of it, let's move on. So what I'm driving at here is one of the things that we're struggling with now, we being the progressive movement, is how do we replace the structures of domination with more viable, more democratic structures? And one of the things that we're realizing, don't ask me who we are, it's just like a handful of friends and sort of the sprinkling of a movement out there. One of the problems is we don't know each other. I don't know if you're familiar with a book called Cultural Creatives by Anderson and Sherry Anderson and Ray Anderson. This book looks at what Americans really think and what they want politically, and comes to the conclusion, which I could have told him, but they didn't ask me, that this left-right, red-blue business is nonsense. It's not what people really are after. There's a whole new political compass, and there's a segment of the population. This is very good sociologists. They did this study about 10 years ago. There are 35 million Americans who want things to be entirely different in what we might call a progressive direction. And the only reason, now 35 million is more than enough to get an election to come out right so dramatically that you couldn't cheat it, which is what we need to do. There's more than enough people. 5 million would probably do it at this time until they get better voting machines. But the reason that these people don't pull together and do something is that they don't know one another. They don't know that there are others. That you sit in your house thinking, you put your little, let's win in Iraq slogan on your front lawn, and you hide behind that, and you hope that your neighbors don't realize that you don't really want to have a war-making country anymore. Meanwhile, your neighbor is thinking the same thing, putting the same silly stuff on his lawn. So one of our great disadvantages is this whole progressive change, the emerging paradigm, all of that. All the ingredients are there, but it hasn't been pulled together yet because we don't know who we are. But whoever we are, one of the things we're struggling with is, instead of building a different structure to control the culture, somehow change the culture so that it will create a different structure. And this means that a different kind of organizing can prevail or take over. And at this point, I'd like to tell you a story that came in on the internet last year after Katrina. I tried to just look up this story, but unfortunately Katrina turns out to be a girl's name as well as the name of a hurricane, so I was getting thousands of Katrinas and I wasn't getting down to the story. But I remember it well. What we all learned in that disaster was the utter incompetence of the central regime, the federal government, to manage it. Right? Because it was based on the wrong principle. They had FEMA is there to take care of emergencies. It's called the Federal Emergency Management Association. But what it really is the Higher Bush's Friends Association. It's based on cronyism, not on competence. In fact, I'd like to take this slogan and offer it to Barack Obama and anybody who's listening out there. Competence, not cronyism. Right? Maybe it won't possibly make as much a difference as I think, but I thought it was kind of neat at 4 o'clock this morning. Anyway, so this is public knowledge now. We all have this lesson. The central government failed. What we don't know is that there were other organizing systems that did not fail. And there was a story by a doctor who was in a hospital in New Orleans. It was completely flooded out. A students have heard this once already. So there's no power, and you have patients in very bad shape. They've got to be evacuated. A convoy of army trucks comes slogging up through the water to evacuate these patients, but how are you going to get them out? The next thing you knew, the doctors, the nurses, the ambulatory patients, the volunteers, everybody had pulled themselves into a structure, if you will, and everybody knew exactly what to do, and they did it, and they got those people out of there in no time. So, you had big, strong people picking up patients with IV tubes coming out of them, walking down 7 flights of stairs in 110-degree heat, getting them into the trucks. The point that fascinated this young doctor was nobody was in charge. Nobody gave orders. There was no lab, so he didn't get on and say, okay, get up to Ward 6. Everything happened automatically. So what we're trying to develop is a way that the self-organizing structures can emerge from the culture and replace the suppressive domination by central hierarchical mechanisms. And that you'll find that this is exactly what Gandhi was actually doing, especially in slightly less acute emergencies. He always said, I have never led the people. What I do is I listen carefully to them, and I hear what they want, and I help them get it. So he thought of himself as a facilitator, as some kind of spontaneous self-organizing process. But let's not kid ourselves. There are spontaneous self-organizing processes that are extremely deadly. We studied these last semester when we were talking about scapegoating, where groups of people not only can, but will, left to their own devices, pull themselves into some kind of tense structure where troublemakers are going to be identified and expelled. And this happens even at the pre-human level. We have monkeys that do this. And so this gets us back to what Augustine was talking about with the 2 drives. We need a way to capture, to facilitate the positive love, if you will, and not the negative one. There's incidentally a modern version of this mantra of his, which I'm sure many of you have heard. Again, it goes around the internet. It's a Native American grandfather says to his grandson, son, I feel that there are 2 wolves fighting inside of me, and one of them is a very strong, loving, calm, peaceful animal, and the other is a savage, out-of-control beast. And the grandson says, for heaven's sake, look, he wouldn't say that, Native American. He says, gosh, grandfather, which one is going to win? And what does he say? The one that I feed. So realistically, what a culture does is it feeds the positive and starves the negative onward that's in each individual. And this brings us to a very clear understanding of the situation that we're in right now. We have created a culture which, not to put too fine a point on it, I have to say, I think this is the worst culture I've ever encountered. And this is from somebody who has studied ancient world, medieval world, modern world. I spent a lot of time looking at cultures. I didn't know that that's what I was interested in, but I was. I was asking myself, how did ancient Greece work? And all the rest of it. And I've never seen a culture as destructive as ours. It's like 95% getting the negative drive up on through to the higher ranking structures, such that you have a president. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't genuinely moved. We have a picture of him weeping because of a fallen Marine. That's one fallen Marine. We've got something somewhere between 40 and 100,000 fallen Iraqis, and he didn't weep. The entire structure has become a structure for organized violence. I had a colleague who once objected very strongly to this and said, you can't say that the military is organized violence. I said, okay, it's disorganized violence. But this is what we're getting at, and this is what I'm saying, that nonviolence is really effective at all of these levels. It's trying to come up with new ways of organization. And as we look at some of the movements that have taken place recently and are taking place now, we're going to try to understand how they organize themselves. And it's kind of hard because they often do it in ways that we're not familiar with and ways that are not documented. Okay, so I just want to say one really negative thing about our culture. I think it is important for us to recognize this and to know what we're really up against. This is probably the most depressing thing I'm going to have to share with you all semester, so let's try and get through it very quickly and move on to the other stuff. But I was reading a friend of mine, I guess, who is a therapist, had a young woman, a teenager, I believe, was a patient who had hurt herself, and she had cut the word empty on her forearm. And it really this struck me because I was remembering that scene in a film that we saw last semester where the civil rights workers went into an area where they knew they might be very seriously attacked. They were very badly beaten, and all over the country you saw pictures of them with teeth coming out, the black eye and everything. And they said, we made our bodies into living witnesses for the law, for the suffering that we had to take on. Well, this struck me very much, the story of this young lady, because it seemed to me that what she unconsciously had done was internalize the basic message of our culture. Let me just get through this and we'll get back up to the rescue part. But we are exposed to something on the order of 3,000 commercial messages a day, and there's a subtext in every one of those messages which is telling you, you are empty. You need something. If you even glimpsed for one moment what there is inside of you, you wouldn't have to buy my product, or much of anything else for that matter. So what's happened is, it's not like we're bad people or anything. We're just people. Everybody's got 2 wolves going on in there somewhere. But because of technology, we've given an enormous amount of power to groups that are organized for exploitive purposes. And I started talking about this a little bit last time. The struggle, again, just comes back down to which purpose is society going to be organized for? Is it for life or is it for profit, basically? David Korten, who is originally an economist, has been writing about these issues, wrote a book called When Corporations Rule the World, and he wrote another book after that called The Post-Corporate World, and then his most recent book is called The Great Turning. And if you think about corporations, there's nothing wrong with corporations per se. I run one. It has a staff of 2 people, 6 volunteers, and most of whom are in this room. And it's not that corporations themselves are bad, but something happens to them when they go beyond human scale and they lose sight of everything except their own materialistic parameters for well-being, right? The bottom line, better corporations. And along the way, 2 very drastic things happen that intercept the good drive in people. Okay? One of them is you deprive people of their responsibility. Right? If I were to invest in a corporation, which is a little bit more likely than coming to class with a loaded 9mm in my pocket, but not totally unlikely. If I invest in a corporation, I am not legally responsible for anything that corporation does. In fact, in the German word for corporation is Gesellschaft mit begrenzten Häften, which means, thanks Amy, an organization with limited liabilities. Right? So I can't go down to, let's say, Nicaragua, because I have Nicaragua on the brain these days, and kill some poor person, but I can invest in a company that's creating a structure which structurally makes it impossible for that person to live and not be held accountable. So it takes responsibility out of me and puts it in an artificial structure which does not exist. I mean, if we all decide tomorrow that Microsoft does not exist and nobody goes to work at that company, it will fail to exist. Some might say that this would actually be an advantage. That's, you can go back to using WordPerfect and OpenOffice and all of those programs, but whatever. It's an artificial thing, whereas a person is not. That's why nonviolence keeps trying to put its focus back on the person, on the individual. So it takes responsibility away from the person, and it gives an artificial sense of rights to an abstract entity that doesn't really exist. And it's interesting that this crept into the structure in a very backdoor way. The Supreme Court did not decide that corporations have rights. Congress did not mandate it. One circuit judge somewhere in some ruling in the early part of the 20th century, and this was so 20th century, decided that corporations should be treated as though they had rights. And that has become globalism, where you can march into a country and say, you don't own your land, you don't own your water, we get to make you sick, and you can't stop us, because if you interfere with us making a profit, we will sue you. So the basic mistake there, which we're going to be struggling to correct through nonviolent methods, is that you take responsibility away from the person, the humanity in effect away from the person, and pretend that it's in a large corporate entity. So one of my favorite, let's see, okay, we're down the right place. One of my favorite slogans for what we're trying to do is not to put a different kind of people in power, but to put a different kind of power in people. Or to put it in a slightly different way, to mobilize the positive power that people have, support them institutionally with the stories that we tell ourselves in our culture, and have it become a structure. Yeah?
How do we actually accomplish that? We are induced.
Okay.
That person knows we have one just like one by this something.
Okay.
But how do we manage this one?
Right. Well, this is I knew this question was going to come up. I've actually got some things to say about it here. The question is, okay, we can do this individually. We can decide, I'm going to bike to work, and I'm going to try to not hate people and stuff like that, whether they deserve it or not. But how does this get built into the culture and become part of the structure? Okay, I'm going to say that the reason that we have such hesitation about that is in itself part of the lie of the prevailing culture, which tells us that you as an individual are powerless. But having said that, I'm going to give you a more honest answer and say, I don't know. But we are starting to study this to some degree. Since that book in 1962 called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which popularized the concept of paradigm and paradigm shift, people have been studying how these big changes happen, and I guess this book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Tipping Point, it's interesting that he's a business professional, and that book is read in business schools. It should be read in revolutionary cells all over, Al-Qaeda should be reading this book. But the tipping point discovery is that in any group, there are key individuals whose decisions automatically communicate themselves to large numbers of other people. One classic example will maybe make this vivid. If you grew up in this country, went to high school in the US of A, you know all about Paul Revere. You know that the British were attacking in, I guess, Boston Harbor or someplace in New England, and they had the signal set up, and they were going to alert the Minutemen, so they would come out and shoot the British, and then we'd have America. And so Paul Revere got on his horse in the middle of the night, and he's riding north somewhere out of Boston, knocking on people's doors and saying, the redcoats are coming, the redcoats are coming. And people throw open their window, and they look down and say, oh my God, it's Paul Revere, the redcoats are coming. They grab their guns, and they get ready to create the United States of America. So that's the history that we all learned in school. But what Malcolm Gladwell discovered was that Paul Revere was one of about 3 or 4 people who were sent out in different directions. And so these other people, they would come riding up to your house and knock on the door and say, the redcoats are coming. And you look out the window and say, huh, it's Nagler, and they go back to sleep. So at least the situation is not as hopeless as it looks, even without the internet, because if we can get this story embedded in key individuals and they can interact with one another in a creative way, there is absolutely no reason why this could not radiate out through the entire culture very quickly. Yeah, John? Yes, I would call that an example of person power. It's one kind of power that specific individuals have. Yeah. Yes, Elena?
However, it seems that people are prone to obedience,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of
Yeah.
and like seem to like hierarchy.
Yeah.
And I mean, like not maybe not like are prone to follow it.
Yeah.
Other people are doing,
Yeah.
are doing it that way. And so it seems like it would be harder to
Uh-huh.
self-organize
Yeah.
when there are very, very organized structural
Yeah.
systems already in place telling people what to do.
Yeah, that's all perfectly true what Yelena is saying. That there are people have a tendency in them to want to obey hierarchical directives. That's the Milgram experiments that we've all learned about, very demoralizing. But I would say, hey, look, this was a hierarchy, and a lot of people were in it because they wanted to obey Gandhiji. But it was a hierarchy that led them to